Night fell like velvet stretched over a tired sky, and the house breathed the hush of routines that had forgotten how to feel tender. Amelia sat at the edge of the bed, smoothing the bedsheet into obedient lines, a small ritual of order in a life that had slowly become noise and blur. She heard Richard's footsteps pause at the door, hesitant, then suddenly bright with a practiced cheerfulness. He came in bearing a wrapped box tied with a satin ribbon too grand for a Tuesday, the kind of ribbon that pretends not to know it arrives late. "You deserve something beautiful," he said, but the words trembled as though they, too, were surprised to find themselves in this room. When Amelia opened the box, the dress glimmered, red like a whisper that grows reckless, cut in a way that invited eyes rather than conversation, a departure from the quiet silhouettes she wore. Her fingers brushed the fabric, and her heart, weary from trying, dared to reach toward hope. She rose and held the dress at arm's length, letting it drape against the dim light, a river of crimson spilling from her hands. The silk was cold, too cold, and it startled her how garments can carry weather inside them, the memory of where they have been, the temperature of other stories. She imagined herself wearing it, imagined Richard's steady gaze, imagined laughter that didn't sound like apology. Beneath the silk, a slip of tissue paper rustled like an anxious sigh. "Wear tomorrow," Richard said, and he leaned in to kiss her forehead the way he used to, except now the gesture felt curated, as if he were placing a flower in a vase for guests. She nodded, a small bow to the theater of peace, and he, relieved, let the moment close around them like curtains after a final scene. Alone again, Amelia pressed the fabric to her cheek and felt a scent that was not hers, an expensive brightness, floral with a sharp, sweet edge, a perfume that understood entrances. She told herself it belonged to the boutique, to the salesgirl who had wrapped the box, to the store's air that must always smell like something purchasable. And yet the scent clung too cleverly, touched her in a way that felt familiar and not kind. Still, she folded the worry under the thrill that someone had remembered her, had chosen a gift for her, had wanted her to be seen. She set the dress carefully on the chair, turned off the light, and lay down. The dark was gentle, the quiet was not. Hope hummed, fear hissed, and somewhere between them, sleep arrived without promising anything. Morning threaded its silver needles through the blinds, stitching light into the room, but mending nothing. Amelia brewed tea the way her mother taught her. Slow pour, patient steam, a pinch of ginger to persuade the day to behave. The kitchen had the pleasant disorder of family life, Grace's water bottle, a math notebook half open, a spoon left to remember porridge. Richard's mug sat where he used to sit, and now only briefly visits. He arrived in the doorway with his phone in his hand and a smile that invented reasons. "Back-to-back meetings," he said, the daily gospel. He kissed Grace's hair, took a sip, and then checked the time as if it might try to escape him. When he left, the door clicked softly, and that softness felt like a kind of cruelty, gentle enough to make you doubt yourself. Amelia washed the mugs and let the water run longer than necessary, as if it could rinse the house of the residue of what they no longer said. She remembered their beginnings, two people in an apartment too small for their promises, laughing about nothing, eating jollof late at night, planning a future in which they would always have time. But time, in its sly ambition, had taken their plans and stretched them until they faded. Work grew like a tall building, casting a shadow over their mornings. Arguments learned to walk on tiptoes, happening in glances and in the angle at which a phone lay face down. The fracture didn't roar. It clicked politely, the way a surgeon snaps on gloves. The red dress, folded in the bedroom, felt like a visitor listening from the next room. Grace came back for her forgotten notebook, cheeks windbright, eyes tender with questions she hadn't yet learned to ask. "Mommy, are you coming to the school music show next week?" she asked, and Amelia wiped her hands and knelt to eye level, promising yes with a smile that meant it. Children always find straight paths through grown-up mazes. Grace did not measure time in meetings or deadlines. She measured it in who sat in the front row when the violin squeaked out a brave song. "Daddy said Auntie Clara likes music too," she added, casual as sunshine, and the name fell like a coin into a quiet well. Amelia blinked, then smoothed Grace's collar and sent her off with a kiss. After the door shut, She let the name sit on the table beside the teaspoon, small and shiny and impossible to ignore. The dress lay on the chair like a secret rehearsing itself, its red growing bolder with the day. Grace tiptoed into the bedroom the way children do when they believe they are discovering treasure. "Wauve," she breathed, the word balloon in the air. "Mommy, why do you have Auntie Clara's dress?" The sentence came out sweetly, kindly, and for a second the entire house tilted. Amelia stood very still and then very slowly turned, the way one does when music has stopped unexpectedly. "What did you say?" she asked, shaping each word carefully, afraid of breaking it. Grace, proud to be helpful, pointed to the cowl neckline and the tiny charm sewn into the seam. "Auntie Clara wore it when Daddy picked me up last week. She told me it was her lucky red. She said we shouldn't tell you because it was a surprise. Innocence is a candlestick that does not know it has set the room on fire." Amelia glanced at the charm. A tiny gold crescent nestled so discreetly into the hem she might have missed it forever. The scent rose again, unashamed, no longer masquerading as a boutique. She remembered how Grace had been giddy that afternoon, humming a tune she didn't learn at home, and how Richard had arrived later than usual with a look that asked not to be asked. "Auntie Clara said the dress makes wishes come true," Grace added, frowning a little, unsure why the air had suddenly grown heavy. Amelia knelt and placed both hands on her daughter's shoulders. "Thank you for telling me," she said softly, and the gratitude was real. The pain, too large to name, waited its turn like weather on the horizon. Grace's brow puckered, and she leaned closer, conspiratorial. "Mommy, you'll look prettier than Auntie Clara in it," she promised, in the way children offer the correct medicine to an incorrect wound. Amelia felt a tremor pass through her, something that was not quite anger, not quite grief, but the moment just before a bell rings. She hugged Grace tightly, breathed through her daughter's hair, and found her voice again. "Go wash your hands for lunch," she said gently. When the child scampered off, Amelia lifted the dress once more, but this time she held it like evidence. Every stitch now read like handwriting. Every fold repeated a sentence she had hoped never to hear. Yet even in that certainty, there was a second certainty forming in the calmest part of her. She would not shatter. She would study the shards. The afternoon performed its errands. Pans clinked, laundry swayed on the line. The neighborhood's music drifted in and out like helpful gossip. Amelia moved through tasks with careful grace, her mind walking a parallel road lined with scenes that, when gathered together, spelled something she didn't want to read. Clara at the school gate with a laughter too bright for ordinary weather. Clara's text appearing once on Richard's phone, made a home, which he'd dismissed with a chuckle and a lie about a group chat. The time she'd found a hairpin under the passenger seat, gold with a tiny crescent that she'd brushed aside as nothing, the way we brush away the first ant and pretend it is not a column. Suspicion, once invited to sit, soon begins rearranging furniture. She took the dress to the window and examined the hem. The little crescent winked, as if it enjoyed being found. She traced the seam with her finger and felt, inside herself, a decision harden like cooling metal. Not a downward decision, no storm, no ransacking, but a quiet, ascending resolve. She would not present herself to Richard as a scene he could point to and say, "See, you are the problem." No, she would become a mirror, polished and still, and let him meet himself. The power of stillness had been her mother's wisdom. When you stop chasing the truth turns and follows you home. The dress returned to the chair to its corner, and Amelia to the kitchen where onions waited with their honest tears. As twilight softened the street, Amelia stood by the sink and watched the sky bruise and heal. She thought of vows said over a cake and a chorus of witnesses who had believed them. She remembered Richard's fingertips tracing plans on her palm, a map he had promised to travel with her, not away from her. Betrayal, she realized, does not begin with a kiss. It begins with the first withheld truth, the first small thing that chooses a pocket over a table. She breathed, slow and even. If there was more to discover, it would come. If there was less, the dignity of her caution would still be her own. She turned off the light in the kitchen and left the window open, to let the evening's honesty move through the house. Dinner carried the flavor of ceremony. Rice that knew it was being observed, stew that tried to be cheerful, cutlery that understood rhythm. Richard arrived late with apologies that did not sweat. He took his seat like a man returning to a chair he believed would always remember him. Grace animated the table with stories about music practice, her bow sliding and squeaking and becoming, in her telling, a swan. Amelia served, listened, and wore calm like a linen shawl, light, breathable, impossible to catch fire. The red dress waited in the bedroom, a witness refusing to be bored. Richard glanced toward the corridor once, measuring whether its absence on her body should worry him. When he judged the moment safe, he asked playful, "So, will you try on your surprise?" Amelia lifted her eyes to his and let the quiet lengthen until it had authority. "I don't wear another woman's clothes," she said, her voice neither sharp nor shaking, simply correct as a name. Grace paused, spoon midair. The music of dinner suddenly muted. Richard blinked, looked at his plate, then looked up again with a grin that tried too hard to be unaware. "What do you mean?" His tone aimed for amused. It landed near brittle. Amelia's face did not change. She did not mention the charm, nor the perfume, nor the school pickup. She did not offer anger he could argue with. She offered only the sentence, polished to a mirror. In it he saw himself. The room remained astonishingly gentle, while everything inside it rearranged itself. Grace resumed eating in small, careful motions, as if she were learning table manners all over again. Richard cleared his throat and found refuge in talking about schedules, the weather, a colleague's new car that was not even that impressive. Amelia nodded pleasantly when the conversation allowed it. But under the linen shawl of her calm, a storm gathered with exquisite discipline, not to destroy, but to cleanse. People imagine storms always rage. They forget how quietly rain can insist. When the plates were washed and the house had settled, Amelia tucked Grace into bed, kissed her forehead, and stood for a long time at the doorway. Tomorrow would ask for more of her, and she would have it ready. The red dress would not rest. Its fragrance clung to Amelia's thoughts, like smoke that refuses to leave the curtains. On Saturday, she carried it folded neatly in a paper bag and walked to a boutique she often visited for small gifts. The shop was filled with fragrances whispering from glass bottles, their labels shimmering like secrets. She asked the attendant if she could identify the perfume on the dress. The woman leaned in, inhaled, and smiled knowingly. "This is velour rouge," she said, tapping a bottle on the shelf. "It is very popular with one of our regulars, Clara. She buys it almost monthly." The name was spoken lightly, but to Amelia, it thundered like a gavel in a courtroom where no judge had been invited. Her hand tightened on the bag, but her face remained calm, schooling itself into neutrality. She asked questions about price, nodded politely, thanked the attendant, and left. Outside, the afternoon sun felt like interrogation lamps. The truth had stepped out of shadows and into her hands, proof in the form of scent, a perfume that had been wrapped around another woman and delivered to her, as if she were a bin for cast-offs. The insult was deeper than betrayal. It was a mocking gift, a cruel theater performed with satin and silence. As she walked home, she saw children racing with kites and thought of Grace, so unshielded in her innocence, already brushing shoulders with deception she did not understand. Her daughter's words replayed in her head, Auntie Clara's dress. It was not a suspicion anymore. It was a fact with a perfume, a fact with a name. And yet Amelia did not break. She felt the weight inside her chest, but she carried it like iron carried fire, shaping it quietly, waiting until the right moment would demand its form. That night, the house was heavy with quiet. Amelia turned in bed, while Richard faced the window, phone pressed close to his lips. His voice was low, but intimacy always leaks through tone. She caught fragments, laughter too warm for colleagues, pauses too long for business. Once, unmistakably, the name Clara. It was not the way one says a name at work, it was the way one touches it like fabric, like flame. Amelia lay with her back to him, eyes wide in the dark, her breath steady so he would not suspect. Every syllable stabbed confirmation into her bones. When he ended the call, he turned and draped an arm over her. His touch was casual, as though arms were not bridges between trust and deceit. She remained still, letting him believe she slept. His breathing soon evened, but Amelia's heart would not. The phone, face down on the nightstand, gleamed faintly as if it were proud of its secrets. She stared at it for a long time, then closed her eyes, whispering prayers not for his faithfulness, but for her strength. Dawn found her sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at her hands. Marriage vows are stitched from thread that can either bind or strangle. She had believed his promises once. She now wore them like weights. The quiet rage within her did not boil. It cooled into resolve, a river beneath ice. Richard rose, humming, kissed her cheek perfunctorily, and rushed out with the phone tucked in his pocket like contraband. Amelia remained behind, her eyes hollow but unbroken. She would not confront him yet. Not until her silence became sharp enough to pierce. The following week, Amelia was in the kitchen when Grace bounded in with the clumsy joy only children carry. "Mommy, guess what?" she chirped. "Daddy let Auntie Clara sit in the front seat yesterday, and I sat at the back. Auntie Clara even bought me ice cream." Amelia's hand froze on the pot handle. Grace beamed, licking her lips at the memory, unaware she was placing arrows into her mother's chest. She said Daddy drives her a lot because they're best friends. Amelia knelt slowly, looking into her daughter's eyes, the wide pools of truth that didn't know they could drown someone. "Sweetheart," she said softly, "when you're with Daddy and Auntie Clara, always remember to tell Mommy what you see. Okay?" Grace nodded eagerly, proud to be trusted with something important. Amelia hugged her tightly, hiding her face in the child's curls, because the tears had risen and she could not let them fall. The innocence of her daughter was a lantern, and in its light, the shadows of betrayal grew grotesque and undeniable. Later, when Grace skipped off to her room, Amelia sat at the dining table in silence. She replayed her daughter's words again and again, each one a pebble dropped into the deep well of her heart. Auntie Clara, ice cream, best friends, sitting in the front seat. Amelia realized her daughter had already been folded into the theater of lies. It was no longer just a betrayal of marriage. It was an infection spreading into motherhood, into Grace's understanding of family. That realization hardened Amelia's silence into strategy. She would not explode. She would not storm. She would prepare. The following Friday, Richard announced a dinner with his business partners. "Wear the red dress," he instructed, smiling the smile of a man who believes he controls the script. Amelia looked at him across the living room, her expression unreadable. "That dress doesn't belong to me," she replied softly. Richard's smile faltered. He adjusted his tie, laughed lightly, as if she had made a small joke. "What do you mean?" he asked, tone sharpening at the edges. Amelia placed her hands neatly on her lap and repeated, "I don't wear another woman's clothes." Her voice was calm, not accusatory, the kind of calm that disarms because it refuses to fight. Richard blinked, his confidence slipping for a fraction of a second before he masked it with irritation. "You're overthinking," he muttered, grabbing his keys. But her words stayed with him, hovering like smoke he couldn't wave away. When the door slammed, Amelia sat very still. She did not cry nor pace. She simply existed in the silence, her stillness heavier than rage could ever be. For the first time, Richard had felt the edges of her knowledge. For the first time, he understood that silence can be louder than any accusation. And Amelia, staring at the empty doorway, understood something even more important. The power was shifting. It happened at a cousin's wedding, bright music, lace gowns shimmering, the air thick with perfumes competing for dominance. Amelia entered gracefully, her Ankara dress modest but regal. And there, across the courtyard, stood Clara in a gown that caught light like it had rehearsed for the role. She laughed too loudly, placed her hand too comfortably on Richard's arm. The jewelry on her neck glinted, and Amelia recognized it instantly. It was the necklace Richard had once claimed he lost on a business trip, the one Amelia had mourned as though it were a memory, not just a trinket. Their eyes met. Clara's lips curved into a smile that was less greeting and more announcement. I am here, and I am not hiding. The crowd around them blurred. Amelia held her gaze, her own face serene, refusing the invitation to be small. She did not step forward, did not confront, did not crumble. Instead, she turned gracefully, taking her seat with poise that made Clara's laughter sound hollow. The room adjusted around Amelia's dignity, as if the air itself had chosen sides. Richard felt the tension burn through his suit. His mistress on one arm, his wife on the other side of the hall, both women aware of each other, both watching him. Clara whispered into his ear, smug, but Richard's eyes flickered toward Amelia, who sat tall, her presence commanding without a word. It was in that moment he realized something he had long forgotten. Amelia was not weak, only silent. And silence, when it decides to speak, does not stutter. The house was wrapped in a quiet afternoon when Grace returned from school, her little face pinched with worry instead of the usual sparkle. She clutched her bag tightly and lingered in the doorway of Amelia's room. "Mommy," she began, her voice trembling. "Auntie Clara said I shouldn't tell you everything about Daddy, because you won't understand." The words dropped like stones into Amelia's chest. She set aside her needlework and pulled Grace close, smoothing her curls with hands that ached to tremble but refused. Grace's innocence, her honesty, was the lantern Amelia had leaned on for weeks. Now, to hear that Clara had asked her to keep secrets, had drawn her child into the theater of betrayal, was more cruel than any perfume-stained dress. Grace's eyes watered as she whispered more, confessing that Auntie Clara had bought her sweets, had whispered in her ear that grown-ups sometimes have surprises Mommy doesn't need to know. Amelia felt her heart constrict, not just from betrayal, but from the awareness that her daughter was being made a participant in deception she should never have to touch. She hugged the child tightly, shielding her from a storm she could not yet name, whispering, "You don't have to keep secrets from me, Grace. You can always tell me the truth." And in those words, Amelia reclaimed at least one piece of her daughter's innocence. When Grace finally drifted off for a nap, Amelia sat alone in the quiet, staring at the window where the curtain swayed like a weary flag. She realized Clara's poison had reached too far. This was no longer just a marital betrayal. It was a corruption that had dared to involve her child. A tear slid down Amelia's cheek, but she brushed it away quickly. Her tears would not be the story. Her strength would. For if Clara was bold enough to manipulate her daughter, then Amelia would need to be bold enough to end the game, not with shouting, but with a silence sharpened into a blade. One afternoon, while folding laundry, Amelia opened Richard's wardrobe to place his shirts in order. A small envelope slipped from the inside pocket of his blazer and fluttered to the floor. She bent to pick it up, her hands moving slowly, as though the envelope itself had gravity. Inside were receipts, jewelry, shoes, handbags, dinners at restaurants she had never visited. The handwriting on the signatures was his, but the gifts had never been hers. They had been hers in theory, but Clara's in reality. Every line item was another betrayal, another affirmation that while she had been cooking meals in a quiet kitchen, Clara had been dining on their money in the glow of chandeliers. Amelia sat on the floor, the receipts spread around her like pieces of a puzzle she already knew the picture of. The irony was sharp. Richard, who once scolded her for spending a little extra on Grace's school shoes, had spent fortunes on another woman's vanity. The cruelty was not in the money, it was in the value it revealed. To him, Clara was worth extravagance, while Amelia was expected to find dignity in frugality. She gathered the receipts into a neat pile, tying them with the ribbon that had once wrapped the red dress. Evidence, not accusation, would be her companion. That night, she made dinner as usual, her hands steady though her heart was heavy. Richard came home late, laughing into his phone, carrying the scent of expensive cologne she knew wasn't for her. He dropped a kiss on her cheek absent-mindedly and tossed his jacket carelessly onto the chair, the same jacket that had carried proof of his deceit. Amelia served his meal with grace, her silence no longer empty, but filled with intention. He thought he was living in control, but Amelia now understood she had already begun to shift the balance. The woman who holds the truth holds the power, and she was learning how to wield it quietly. The family wedding buzzed with color, women in geli that shimmered like crowns, men in a bodice stitched with pride. The air smelled of jollof rice, perfume, and anticipation. Amelia arrived with grace, their presence gentle yet dignified. She wore a simple gown, not flamboyant but carefully chosen, the kind that commands attention without raising its voice. And then Clara appeared, radiant in a gown that sparkled too eagerly, her laughter slicing through the air as she clung to Richard's arm. Whispers stirred among the crowd, for everyone knew Richard's wife was in attendance, and everyone could see Clara's boldness. Clara's eyes met Amelia's across the courtyard, and she smiled with calculated cruelty, as though to say, "I have what you don't." She leaned into Richard's shoulder, loud enough for nearby guests to hear her mock Amelia's age and style, flaunting her own youth and extravagance. Amelia, however, remained still, her back straight, her gaze calm, her dignity an armor no jewel could outshine. People began to watch more closely, not Clara's glitter, but Amelia's silence. There is a strength that cannot be mocked, a beauty that cannot be touched by cruelty. Amelia embodied it fully that night. Richard squirmed under the weight of two worlds colliding, the mistress on one side, smug and daring, the wife on the other, regal and unflinching. Business associates whispered, exchanging looks, questioning the man who allowed his household to become gossip at a wedding. Richard laughed awkwardly, pretending not to notice. But Clara's bold display had already written his shame in the air for all to read. Amelia said nothing, but her silence was a statement louder than Clara's mocking laughter. And everyone present understood it. It began with small murmurs. A business partner declined a meeting, citing personal matters. A client postponed a contract signing. Richard shrugged first, dismissing it as coincidence. But in the days after the wedding, his phone rang less, his emails answered slower, and whispers followed him like shadows. Men who had once praised his charisma now questioned his integrity. "If he cannot manage his home," one associate said quietly at a gathering, "how can we trust him to manage millions?" The words burned deeper than any financial loss. Reputation, once dented, bleeds quickly. Richard returned home irritable, snapping at Amelia, accusing her of making him look small by her coldness at the wedding. But Amelia did not respond with anger. She simply met his fury with stillness, her calm stripping his accusations of energy. "You make yourself small, Richard," she finally said one evening, her voice steady, "by giving the world reasons to laugh at you." He stormed out, slamming the door, but the words clung to him, gnawing where pride was weakest. Clara, emboldened by her public recognition, became reckless. She flaunted their outings on social media, hinting at gifts, posting pictures with jewelry that others quickly recognized as Richard's choices. He began to feel the consequences of a mistress who did not understand discretion, who craved attention at the expense of his dignity. Amelia watched quietly as his empire, built on pride, began to crack under the weight of his own choices. She did not hasten the fall. She simply let the gravity of truth do its work. Amelia knew then that silence was no longer just survival. It was strategy. She began to take careful steps, securing her personal finances, opening an account in her name alone, and gathering every receipt, every message, every quiet proof of Richard's betrayal. She did not plan to scream or expose him recklessly. She planned to be ready when the storm finally demanded witnesses. Her calm was not emptiness, it was preparation. Each night, she tucked Grace into bed with kisses and reassurances, building a world of love around her daughter, while outside, Richard's world grew more brittle. The contrast sharpened. Where Clara's laughter mocked and Richard's temper flared, Amelia's quiet devotion to Grace became a fortress. She refused to let the ugliness of betrayal poison the child further. And in that strength, she found a new dignity that no man's betrayal could erase. Meanwhile, Richard began to sense the shift. He noticed Amelia's steady gaze, her lack of outbursts, her refusal to play the role of the broken, begging wife. Her silence unnerved him more than any confrontation. For a man who thrived on control, nothing was more terrifying than a woman who had discovered her power and no longer needed his validation. And Amelia, though scarred, was now sharpening herself into the blade that would cut through his pride at the appointed time. The evening Amelia chose for her quiet strike was deliberate. Richard had invited his business associates for dinner at their home, desperate to restore his image after weeks of whispered doubts. Amelia prepared the table with elegance, laying out dishes that smelled of warmth and tradition: jollof rice simmering with peppers, goat meat spiced to perfection, fried plantains golden and inviting. Guests arrived in fine suits, exchanging polite smiles, and Amelia welcomed them with dignity, her calm presence softening the air. For a moment, even Richard felt reassured. Perhaps tonight would mend what had cracked. But then Clara arrived uninvited, her heels clicking against the tiles like daggers. She strutted into the dining room in a glittering gown, perfume filling the air as she slid herself too comfortably at Richard's side. Gasps flickered around the table, whispers caught in throats. Clara leaned forward, toasting with a glass of wine, flaunting herself as though she were mistress not of a man but of the evening. Richard's face drained of color, but before he could speak, Amelia rose gracefully and laid a small box on the table. Inside, she revealed the receipts, jewelry, clothing, dinners, all marked with Richard's name, all given to Clara. Her voice was steady, her tone neither bitter nor loud. When you entrust your life and fortune to a man, it is not the gifts he gives another that wound most deeply. It is the mockery of believing you would never find out. Silence roared across the room. The associates stared at Richard with disgust, and Clara, who had come to gloat, suddenly realized she had been exposed as a thief of not just affection, but of reputation. The room was still reeling when Grace, who had been sitting quietly with her crayons at the corner of the table, lifted her innocent eyes and asked the question no adult had dared to voice. "Daddy," she said, her small voice carrying like thunder, "will you give Annie Claire Mommy's things? Shouldn't Mommy get the pretty gifts first?" Her words were sweet, innocent, but they pierced the gathering like a knife sharpened on purity. The men who had been silent now shifted uncomfortably, their eyes cutting toward Richard with disapproval so sharp he nearly staggered. Richard's throat worked as though he were choking, his lips parting and closing, but no excuse would come. Clara shifted in her chair, her confidence draining away as Grace's question painted her in the ugliest light, a thief of both innocence and respect. Amelia placed a gentle hand on her daughter's shoulder, her eyes never leaving Richard's face. "Children," she said softly, "have a way of seeing truth more clearly than we adults do." The guests nodded gravely, their judgment final, their opinion of Richard sealed. Richard wanted to lash out, to defend himself, but his words dried into dust. For all his money, all his power, he had no shield against the honesty of a child. He could not argue with his daughter without admitting guilt. He could not scold Amelia without looking even smaller. For the first time, he felt the weight of a cage he had built for himself, and the key was no longer his. In the weeks that followed, Richard's world unraveled with cruel precision. Business partners withdrew, contracts slipped away like sand through fingers. Clara, once his shadow and delight, grew impatient with his sinking fortunes. She had no loyalty to ruins. The expensive dinners dwindled, the gifts dried up, and when Richard snapped at her one evening out of frustration, Clara's mask cracked. "I didn't come for your love," she hissed. "I came for your money, and now you have none." Her words were acid poured on open wounds. She left without ceremony, not even pretending sorrow, her glittering heels clattering down the hallway one last time. Richard stood staring at the door, the echo of her departure louder than her presence had ever been. He remembered the necklace, the perfume, the laughter, and realized all of it had been currency, not affection. Clara had not been a lover. She had been a mirror reflecting his greed, his pride, his foolishness. Now that mirror had shattered, and all he had left were the shards cutting into his own feet. Amelia watched this collapse quietly, her heart both aching and hardened. She did not gloat, for her dignity would not allow it. But in her silence there was justice. Clara's betrayal was not Amelia's victory. It was Richard's punishment, one he had purchased with his own arrogance. Amelia focused her energy on Grace, shielding her from the ugliness, reminding her that love should be measured in loyalty, not luxury. One evening, Richard returned home broken, his shoulders sagging, his face a portrait of a man who had gambled everything and lost. The empire he had boasted of was shrinking, the friends he had flaunted were gone, and the woman he had risked his marriage for had abandoned him without a backward glance. He found Amelia in the living room, Grace asleep on her lap, her face serene as she hummed softly. He dropped to his knees before her, tears streaking down his once proud face. "Amelia," he whispered, "I was blind. I was foolish. Please forgive me." Amelia looked down at him, her expression calm, her eyes deep pools that no longer pleaded for his love. She remembered the dress, the perfume, the whispered lies, the manipulation of their daughter. She remembered how she had been made to feel small in her own home, mocked by another woman's laughter, overlooked by the man she had given her life to. And now here he was, stripped of wealth, dignity, and pride, begging for what he had treated as disposable. Her words were soft, but they carried the final weight of truth. "I was your wife when you had everything," she said, "but you made me nothing when you had too much. Now, when you have nothing, you remember me. Forgiveness belongs to God. As for me, I choose peace." She rose, carrying Grace in her arms, leaving Richard kneeling, sobbing into the carpet that had once welcomed guests with pride, but now bore witness only to his ruin. In the months that followed, Amelia rebuilt her life not with noise, but with steady grace. She poured her love into Grace, who flourished under her mother's strength and gentleness. She found work managing a small fashion boutique, turning her eye for elegance into quiet success. People admired her not for scandal, but for dignity, for being the woman who endured humiliation yet rose without bitterness. Her story traveled softly but firmly, an anthem of resilience whispered from one household to another. Richard, meanwhile, wandered in regret. He lived smaller now, humbled, haunted by memories of what he had thrown away. Every time he saw Grace, he was reminded of the innocent voice that had exposed him, the truth spoken so plainly it had left no room for denial. He longed for Amelia's forgiveness, but she no longer belonged to the shadow of his pride. She belonged to the light she had built for herself and her daughter. One evening, as Amelia and Grace walked home hand in hand, Grace looked up at her mother with a smile that glowed. "Mommy," she said, "you're the most beautiful woman in the world." Amelia's heart swelled, not from vanity, but from the knowledge that her daughter had seen her strength, her dignity, her refusal to break. And in that moment, Amelia understood that true beauty is not given by a husband's gift or taken by a mistress's laughter. It is born in the silence that survives storms and comes out shining. Please share, like, and subscribe. Thank you for watching.